Hello, welcome to Eastside Stories. My name is Michael Lewis. This is the third in our series of presentations providing an overview of the history of the East Side. These presentations are brought to you by the Eastside Heritage Center. Now, for those of you not familiar with the East Side, it's the communities to the east of Seattle on the far side of Lake Washington. In this presentation, we're going to talk about two things. First of all, the phenomenal growth that took place in the Seattle area between about 1890 and 1910 and the impact that had on the East Side. Second, we'll talk about the ferry system that evolved on Lake Washington to help people get to the East Side and between the East Side and Seattle. Now, when we left off our story last episode, we had the East Side growing fairly slowly based on three industries: coal mining, which was taking place in what's now the southern part of Bellevue and Newcastle and then spread to the south from there; agriculture, which was taking place all over the East Side as families moved out into homesteaded land; and timber and cutting wood and sawmills that were starting to take place. That activity was taking place a little further to the east, around Lake Sammamish mostly. But it was still a fairly slow growth period, in large part because the East Side was just a very difficult place to get to. But before we get to those transportation improvements, we want to talk about this growth that happened in the late 19th century and the impact that would have on the East Side. Here is a map of the Seattle area from 1890. We had this map in our last presentation. What the colored areas show is areas that have been platted out for home building. Now, there weren't homes built on all of these areas, but developers had carved up the land looking for places to put homes. And you can see that that's stretching out really around Queen Anne Hill, toward Magnolia, some in Ballard, but still a little bit sparse. Very little on the east side, a little bit on Mercer Island. Now, let's fast forward 10 years to this map from 1909. And what that shows is an actual street grid. All of that area is central Seattle. Queen Anne Hill, Magnolia, Ballard, Wallingford, up around Green Lake had all been built out by that point. There were houses everywhere and streets everywhere, out into West Seattle, south down into Rainier Valley. You can also see some development activity on the east side, a lot in Kirkland, Mercer Island, and a little bit starting to happen in Bellevue. Now, a popular illustration at the time were these bird's eye views, which were based on actual facts on the ground. The illustrator would start with maps, so they're fairly accurate. And this one was from 1884. We saw this in the last presentation. And again, you can see development happening out of downtown Seattle, up toward Queen Anne Hill and Belltown, but not terribly dense. Now we're going to fast forward here to 1908, and we see that same street grid that we saw in the map earlier, extending up well into the north part of the city, all across the central city, out into West Seattle, and beyond. So the city was really developing quite a lot by this point. There were three big events that caused this spurt of growth over that 20-year period. The first was the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1893. Now, railroads, of course, had reached California much before that, and they'd all reached up to Oregon and even as far as Tacoma quite a bit before this. But there was only a minor spur route that came up to Seattle, and it really didn't connect the city very well. Finally, in 1893, the railroad reached Seattle across the Cascade Mountains, and it had its own link to the central part of the country. So Seattle was now very accessible to people coming in and to products moving out. The second major event was the arrival of scheduled steamship service to Asia in 1896. So with the railroads coming to Seattle, you now had a direct connection for steamships arriving from Asia. The shortest route from Asian ports in Japan or China to the west coast of the United States is to Seattle. Those routes go up around the Aleutian Islands. It's the Great Circle routes. Now, in the days of steamships, when you were shoveling coal into those boilers, the shorter route was always better. And soon the port of Seattle became the largest port on the west coast and the third largest port in the country after New York and Philadelphia. The third big event was the gold rush. The Klondike Gold Rush in 1897 and subsequent gold rushes in Nome and Fairbanks, Alaska shortly after that. The reason the gold rush is so important for Seattle is not so much the gold, although some people did find some gold, but it really had two big effects. The first was on the front end. All those people heading up to the Klondike were required to have a year's worth of supplies. And this is probably 30,000 to 40,000 people came through Seattle. They were required to have a year's worth of supplies, which in today's dollars was maybe $10,000 in equipment and food and everything else they would need, or they wouldn't be allowed to cross the border into Canada. Well, merchants in Seattle sold them all that stuff and made an awful lot of money selling food and products that they brought from the outside and making things locally to sell to these miners. So an awful lot of money came through Seattle on the front end. And then after these people came back, most of whom found no gold, they were really no better off than when they left. But when they came back south, a lot of them stayed in Seattle and increased the population and provided a workforce. In the 1890s, it was a major economic downturn nationally, so a lot of these people had no particular place to go back to, so they settled in Seattle. Now, in 1890, there were about 40,000 people in Seattle. By 1910, there were 250,000 people in Seattle. So almost a five-fold growth. This would be the equivalent today of, say, the city of Mount Vernon up in Skagit County, turning into the city of Spokane over a 20-year period. It's an amazing level of growth that very few places have ever experienced in the United States or in the world for that matter. This was all celebrated in the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exhibition of 1909. You think about the name, Alaska, Yukon, Pacific. Those were all the things that were driving the economy of Seattle at that point and turning it into a major shipping center. So what this growth meant for the east side? Well, first of all those people had to eat. So the food grown in the farms and greenhouses and orchards of the east side had a ready market and a much larger market in Seattle. Secondly, all those people needed food, or needed fuel, and building materials. They needed food as well. And those, of course, would come from the east side, from the coal mines, from the timber mills that were on the east side. Third, and this is something starting to happen, people were moving out of the city, finally. You noticed in that map and the aerial view, Seattle was starting to kind of fill up. And so people looking for a place to live that was maybe a little more affordable, a little less urban, were starting to venture over to the east side. And they weren't farmers or homesteaders, they were going to be commuters. And I know this sort of firsthand. My grandparents had actually met each other in the gold rush in Nome around 1906. They got married, they settled in Seattle in 1909, but they couldn't afford to buy a house. And so finally in 1917, they moved to Medina, where they could afford a little cottage. And there were people like that all over the east side who were commuters. They weren't working in farms or mines, but they were commuting to Seattle. And we'll learn in a second how they would do that. So let's talk about this ferry system. Lake Washington is between 1 and 2 miles wide. It's very deep. Building bridges is a challenge. So to get over to the east side was not easy. The lake can get very rough, so rowing a boat or something like that is not a very pleasant thing to do. So a ferry system sort of took root in the later part of the 19th century. The first steamers were bringing coal from the mines across the lake to Seattle in the 1870s. By the 1880s, passenger steamers started to appear on the lake. And they were hauled up the Black River at first. So before Lake Washington was lowered and the ship canal was built, the lake drained itself through the Black River in Renton, about where the big Boeing factory is today. That river connected up to the Cedar River, and then they both connected up to the Duwamish. So ferries could be dragged up the Duwamish River at high tide when the river was running high and pulled up into Lake Washington. And then you had ferries on the lake, and then enterprising people started to build ferries on the lake itself. So let's look at some of those ferries. This first steamer we see is the C.C. Calkins, and it operated on the lake from the 1880s. It was built primarily to take passengers from Leschi over to Mercer Island. An entrepreneur had built a hotel on the northern tip of Mercer Island as kind of a getaway from Seattle, and the C.C. Calkins brought people over to that hotel. Next we have the Dawn. The Dawn was a smaller steamer that also served the Mercer Island route for quite a number of years, and also served to some extent routes on the east side. The third we have here is the L.T. Haas, and it served a number of communities on the east side. This picture looks to me like Yarrow Bay, but I can't really verify that. There were a lot of these steamers. They didn't last very long. They would burn, they would sink, their boilers would blow up, they would rot. You might get 10 years of service out of them. And there were several dozen of these that operated on the lake from the sort of 1880s, 1890s up into the 1920s and 30s. Now, if you wanted to take one of these ferries, you could go to one of the many ferry docks that were on the lake. These were built and maintained by King County. They stretch all the way from up in Kenmore and Juanita down to Kennydale. But you might also, if you lived near a dock, simply go down to the end of the dock and wave a flag around when you saw one of the steamers, and they would see you and come over and pick you up. These were all independent businesses, so anytime they could find a fare somewhere to pick up, they would do that. They also made money doing excursions on the lake. It's a very popular thing. Moonlight cruises around Mercer Island, or to one of the entertainment venues that was on the east side. So there was one near the shipyard in Houghton. There was the Wildwood Park in Maidenbower Bay, and there was the park on the north side of Mercer Island. All places people would go for an excursion, for a picnic, or sometimes they would simply have a cruise around the lake. Now this ferry system made possible commuting from the east side, and what you started to see by the early part of the 20th century is communities forming of commuters, and then some of the first really large estates along the lake that people would build, wealthy people from Seattle to commute to Seattle, and some of these homes still exist. One of the interesting features of life at the time on the lake was that the homes were all oriented toward the water. Your front door was on the water side because that's how people would arrive. The road to the other side of the house may be a pretty rough track, but people could always arrive on the water to your dock. Areas also had easements along the lake where you were required to provide access along the lake shore so people could get down to the ferry dock. Around this time also, the lake started to host vacation homes. In that time, being in a big city in the summer wasn't always very pleasant. A lot of coal burning factories, wood burning, horses. So if you could get out of the city in the summer, that was to your advantage. And so wealthier people, upper middle class families, would have vacation homes along the lake. Particularly areas like Hunts Point was very popular, Yarrow Point, Enitai, where there was a ferry nearby. So the men could go to work in the morning and their families could stay behind in their vacation home. Now the passenger steamers were fine to a point, but you want to start to move cargo across the lake. The first vehicle ferry, I hesitate to call it a car ferry because there weren't very many cars then around 1900, was a ferry called the King County of Kent. Curious name, and there's a story behind it. And it operated from Madison Park to Kirkland, starting around 1900. Later ferries going to Kirkland from Madison Park included the Lincoln and the Washington, which are both shown here in this picture docked at Madison Park in Seattle. One of the first things the Port of Seattle did after organizing itself was decided to get into the ferry business on the lake. The port wanted to build a steel-hulled ferry to get away from this problem of these wood-hulled ferries not lasting very long. So they commissioned a ferry to be built, but the problem was there was nowhere on Lake Washington at that time where a steel-hulled boat could be built. So the ferry was built on the Duwamish River at one of the shipyards there, and then disassembled, and all the steel parts were taken down to Rainier Beach, and it was assembled on the beach and launched from there. And that was the Leschi. The Leschi ran on a route from Leschi in Seattle to Maidenbower Bay and Medina in a triangle until 1920, when the Maidenbower stop was cut off and the Leschi simply went back and forth from Medina to Seattle. That ferry ran until 1940, the day before the Mercer Island Bridge opened. The ferries continued to run from Madison Park to Kirkland until 1950. Now here we see the last steamer on the lake that operated as a passenger steamer, and that was the Ariel. And it operated until 1945, took passengers from Houghton, across the Points communities to Madison Park. You can experience the history of the ferries on Lake Washington by visiting the many places where there used to be ferry docks. Start at the north at Juanita Bay. There was a ferry dock along the east side of the bay where the causeway is now. In downtown Kirkland, the main pier in downtown Kirkland was the location of the original ferry dock for the ferries that came from Madison Park. In the Points communities, there's two ferry landings on Yarrow Point, one in Evergreen Point. Then the Medina City Hall is the original ferry terminal for the Leschi. Into Maidenbower Bay, Clyde Beach was a ferry terminal, And the original dock for the Leshai was between the Maidenbower Yacht Club and the Bellevue Marina. There's 2 more original ferry dock sites down in Anatai, and there was one down in Newport, but that's no longer in public ownership. So our next program will talk about the road system and how that came to be on the east side. Building roads was not easy out on the frontier, and there was a whole process to do that. We'll also talk about creating community. When people settled in areas like that, there were no institutions at all. There were no schools, no churches, no clubs, and all those had to be created, and we'll talk about that process. So thank you again for watching. We hope you will keep up with these presentations as they roll out into the future. And if you enjoy these, please go to our website and consider making a donation to the Eastside Heritage Center to support our work. Thank you.